On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, escalating trade tensions between China and the United States. What's next? Business and academic leaders try to give their answers in our exclusive interviews. And on the eve of the Summer Davos in Tianjin, Managing Director of the World Economic Forum discusses how the Fourth Industrial Revolution intertwines with geopolitics and societies.
While China is dealing with its own economic challenges, it also has to grapple with one of the most important bilateral relations in the world, that between China and the United States. At the ongoing meeting of the special session of China Development Forum, there are many coming from both sides that are opinion leaders and key decision makers in the process.
This Sunday saw the opening of the autumn summit of the China Development Forum. The two-day summit is being held in Beijing, with China's opening and reform as its theme. At the opening session of the forum, former World Bank President Robert Zoellick recounted his first trip to China in 1980. He said he witnessed the country's remarkable achievements in the past 4 decades himself. Yet, undeniably, the turbulent economic situation in the world has posed enormous challenges for China's future. In his speech, Mr. Zoellick commented that devotion to economic openness is the right way to tackle the challenges.
China has benefited from its openness, and that's true today and will be true in the future. More open investment would offer win-win opportunities, better services, stronger international connections.
Trade tensions between China and the U.S. are at the center of discussion. At the forum, experts concluded that the rise of protectionism and unilateralism in recent years is a major setback for the globalization trend. Former World Bank chief economist Justin Lin Yifu noted that the economies of China and the U.S. are complementary rather than competitive.
The industrial sectors, production in China, are mostly in the low, medium value-added sectors, and the U.S. are in the high value-added sectors. Trade means China will be able to provide low-cost goods to consumers in the U.S. and low-cost intermediate goods to producers in the U.S.
Many experts believe that the ongoing trade war is not only going to hurt China and the U.S., but also all countries involved in the global supply chain.
I've been talking to Steven Orlins, the president of Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Let's listen in our interview. Steve, welcome to CGTN.
Wonderful to be back with you.
I know you've been traveling so much recently as a result of the latest development in U.S.-China relations. Help me to understand, what does it mean at the end of the month, the negotiation between the two sides?
Well, it's good that they're negotiating. It's good that there still is a process by which the United States and China can solve its trade and investment problems. So I think that's positive. I think it's important to recognize that President Trump, this is not something new for President Trump, that for 30 years he's believed that it's an unlevel playing field that has allowed China to get this enormous trade surplus that it has with the United States. So that tells you that it's not going to be easy at the end of the month for the United States and China to reach any kind of agreement where the tariffs that President Trump is talking about do not enter into effect. I think there is some chance that we could, because of the midterm elections in the United States in early November, it is possible that we could see some kind of deal where U.S. exports to China increase tremendously. So we see more agricultural products, we see more machinery, we see more airplanes that are exported to China from the United States. And we have the tariffs not go into effect. I think that's very unlikely, but it's possible because the midterm elections are now tending towards the Democrats. President Trump is obviously a Republican, controlling both the House and the Senate. The House, which has 435 members all up for re-election, the polling is looking like that is going to shift to the Democrats.
But on the other hand, Steve, many argue as a result of this, President Trump, before the midterm election, going to go all his way as long as he believes there's anything that he can do in order to win back, even just for a few votes.
I think the political analysis, if he decides that he wants to make a deal, it would be because the tariffs are negatively impacting states where there are swing seats, where the seat may go Democratic or it may go Republican, especially in agricultural areas. The tariffs are negatively affecting U.S. farmers. If they say, well, we're not going to go out and vote for the Republican, we're just going to vote for the Democrat, or we're not going to vote at all, that might swing the House to the Democratic side. So if President Trump feels that the tariffs are negatively affecting those districts, and it's going to get, by ending the tariffs, it's going to get people to vote for the Republican candidates, it's possible he would make that compromise.
But what are the possibilities, if you could think about it? I know you've been talking to people, insiders related to the negotiations. What could be the topics that the two sides then can really discuss that would make both sides accept eventually? This is very much like almost one of the last negotiations that could happen before the midterm election.
Yes, well, there's short-term issues, so they're tariff issues, they're export issues, they're ones which Chinese government can simply increase exports. This is a short-term solution. We'd see an increase in exports of soybeans, wheat, corn, airplanes, machinery, just have China buying more. So President Trump could announce, well, the tariffs worked, we now have a more balanced trade, something in the neighborhood of 100 billion, even though he's called for 200 billion. So that is one possible outcome.
The reason why there has not been breakthrough is because there have been, some say, unrealistic expectations coming from the U.S. side for the Chinese to react. And many wonder whether the U.S. side is also going to see there's any consensus they are having in terms of reaching an agreement with China. Mutual respect, many say, Steve, is a very important thing. In these kinds of negotiations, there has to be mutual respect. You can't push one person and one country to a corner in order to reach an agreement. It just doesn't work for China.
There is some analysis that we have a split within the administration, that President Trump, Advisor Navarro, and Ambassador Lighthizer really want to take a hard line. They don't want to compromise anything. And Secretary Ross and Secretary Mnuchin and National Economic Advisor Kudlow are much more willing to kind of compromise on some of these issues, give a longer runway to allow things to be implemented, and that to some degree the invitation is a reflection of the Mnuchin-Kudlow view. And President Trump's announcement last night that, his announcement, his subordinates saying to U.S. media that tariffs are going to be implemented on 200 billion, an additional 200 billion of Chinese goods, is a reflection of the Navarro-Lighthizer view. So we're seeing both of the views playing out, and ultimately the decision is going to be President Trump's. That in this administration, President Trump is the decider-in-chief on China policy.
Right.
That the processes that existed in previous administrations, where maybe we had a Secretary of State, a National Security Advisor, a Secretary of the Treasury, is now kind of ended, and it all goes to President Trump to make the decision.
People have been reading the book coming from Bob Woodward, talking about the decision-making process when it comes to the tariffs that the president is so keen to work on vis-a-vis many of the major trading partners of the United States. At the very beginning of this debate, a lot of opposition voices coming from within the White House. Of course, the president is keen to go ahead. What does those stories told by Mr. Bob Woodward tell us about the reasoning of the current policymaking? And as a result of that, the other sides of Washington's, what their reaction should be about President Trump's current approach?
Well, President Trump, Mr. Navarro, Mr. Lighthizer fundamentally believe that an unlevel playing field has led to this enormous bilateral trade deficit that the United States has with China. Whatever the facts are, I believe that view is not correct, but whatever the facts are, that's what they believe, and these policies emanate from those beliefs. That the only way that you kind of have to, in their view, you have to shake it up. So for decades we've negotiated, the American government has negotiated with China for market opening, for investment opening, for reduction of tariffs. The only way we can get anywhere is by shaking it up and imposing these tariffs.
I wonder how people like you could go to sleep at night. I mean, after all, this is the fruit, the U.S.-China relations, of many people over decades to be where it is today. What can you do about the reality? What others who have been working so hard on this bilateral relationship, on this reality?
That you continue to advocate for a constructive relationship, that you continue to advocate for changes both in Chinese policy towards the United States and in U.S. policy towards China.
Is your voice being heard? Is your voice being heard in today's Washington?
Is it being heard? I mean, yes, it's being heard. When this administration remains open to hearing dissenting voices. So when I go down to Washington and visit the Department of Commerce, the Department of State, the Treasury Department, the Defense Department, the National Security Council, the doors remain open to me.
But you said everything about this administration is done by the president, in a way.
The president, but you know, you have to keep advocating for what you believe is the right policy. You keep advocating for what you believe in. I also come to China and I meet with the Chinese leadership and I advocate for changes in Chinese policy towards the United States. I advocate for changes in Chinese global policy. I advocate for more transparency. I advocate for more economic reform. I advocate for more opening. I advocate for more U.S. businesses here. I advocate for monopolies to be broken, because the winners of these policies in China are the Chinese people, without regard to U.S.-China relations. The winners for reform and opening are the Chinese policy. Yes, U.S. companies win too, but that's peripheral. What's core is when reform and opening occurs, as it has over the last 39 years, now 40 years, we see the Chinese people win, and that needs to continue regardless of what happens in U.S.-China relations.
Are we going to see a much worse period of time before things get better?
The atmosphere in the United States is very negative. And I think it's important that people in China understand that it's not only President Trump who has a negative view, and President Trump has had this negative view for 3 decades of China and its dealing in international trade. But the U.S. Congress has a negative view. They have a negative view of a lot of different aspects of Chinese policy. The American media has a negative view. The reporting on China is consistently negative. American think tanks and academia are turning much more negative towards China.
Has it become a self-feeding process in Washington, with all of the factors you just mentioned earlier, that they are feeding each other on the negative feelings about China, and also not necessarily working at all about the solutions?
I think people are looking for solutions. Certainly, we at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations every single day try and figure out ways to make the relationship more constructive, more productive for the people on both sides of the Pacific. And that work continues, us and many other organizations. And there still are enormous numbers of people who believe that together the United States and China have a chance to confront the world problems. But separately, we're both doomed to failure. And in the end, it's going to be the people of the United States and the people of China who decide to tell their governments what should the U.S.-China relationship be. And in my view, the people of the United States do not want a confrontational relationship with China. They don't want to spend money on ships and missiles rather than on infrastructure and education and social programs. And the people in China, the same. They don't want to spend their money on confrontation with the United States. They want to spend their money educating their children, making for a better life for the next generation. The welfare of the people. And ultimately, that is what's going to drive the relationship. So even if we have short and midterm disruption, In the end, the peoples of the United States are going to, and China, are going to pull each other together. And think about the hundreds of thousands of Chinese students in the United States and the tens of thousands of American students here. And that's the next generation. And their greater understanding of each other's societies, they're going to be the policymakers of the future. And the greater understanding is going to lead to closer U.S.-China relations.
We hope that will be the case, even though there have been reporting about President Trump suggesting putting labels on Chinese students in studying in America. But having said that, though, as you may know, China-U.S. relations is not just bilateral. It is also an important relationship on the international stage. We see now, Steve, as you can notice, that the U.S. is trying to withdraw from many of the international institutions, suggesting it is not tipping toward the U.S. side. Many wonder if the United States is really moving forward or moving backward.
President Trump will be president for 4 years, 8 years, we don't know which. And then a new president will come in who will probably have a different view of America's role in the world. You know, U.S. is kind of, it's much more like a pendulum. It swings one way and then it swings the other.
But the world cannot wait just the United States all the time.
I don't think the world is waiting.
On the other hand, you see the impact of U.S.-China relations is making ripple effects about bilateral relations, multilateral relations around the world. You've seen China's interaction with developing countries very actively and frequently recently, China, African countries, for example. And you also see China, Russia, together have been working on bilateral issues and multilateral issues. The two presidents already meeting at least 3 times this year bilaterally. So many wonder whether the United States is really leaving the stage to the other players to interact with one another, and eventually what does that mean for United States itself?
Well, clearly the United States has changed. What happened? We have to go back to the election in 2016, that states which had manufacturing bases which were eroded or the people thought were eroded as a result of globalization decided, you know, in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, decided to vote for Mr. Trump rather than Secretary Clinton. And that presaged America's view, a change in America's view of globalization and its benefits. And that a lot of the policies that you see stem from that election in 2016. So again, we'll have another election in a couple of months, and then we'll have an election in 2020. And I believe we'll see the pendulum swing back. Now, of course, that's not the sole issue in an American.
Will America pushing, as a result, some of the unlike partners together?
I think, you know, like China-Russia relations, China-India relations, U.S.-India relations are determined by national interests and historical legacies. I'm often asked, do I fear a Russian-China cooperative effort against the United States? And my answer is no.
In Washington, when you were being asked that question?
I'm asked all over. I'm asked in the United States. I'm asked in Chinese media. And my answer is no, because I'm a student of Chinese history. I know the history of the Chinese Communist Party and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I know it from the very beginning. I think they're historical legacies that are extremely problematic for any future cooperation. And what I do know about Chinese leadership is they know history. They know history really well, and they don't forget history.
Before we go, Steve, with decades of working on U.S.-China relations and your very intense interactions with both sides, is there something that, a few key words as your advice to both sides leading up to the negotiation later this month and certainly longer prospect of bilateral relations?
I think the longer prospects of bilateral relations remain positive. I think in the end, the problems that the people of the United States and the people of China confront have more in common than they are different. that ultimately, you know, I always think about when I sit in my apartment in New York and I look out, it always reminds me of the problems that we confront. You know, I see Wall Street from my apartment. I can see the towers of Wall Street. And I remember the economic crisis of exactly 10 years ago this week. And that is a great fear of all Americans, and it's a great fear of all Chinese. And only if we work together are we going to be able to solve that. And then I see the Hudson River from my apartment, and I remember, you know, we had a superstorm that basically wiped out Lower Manhattan. It flooded everywhere. The subways closed. The city became non-functional. And it's a result of climate change. And ultimately, the states of the United States know it. The leadership in China knows it. And at some point, the federal government in the United States is going to recognize that this is the case. And the United States and China are going to have to come together to combat combat climate change, because they're the leading countries. And third and finally, I look out and I see the site of 9/11 from the apartment. I see the new buildings that are going up. And I realize that a great threat, that what Americans, what people in New York think about, is terrorism. We always worry about terrorism because we lived through 9/11. We've just last week gone through another anniversary of 9/11 where they stand at the site of 9/11 and the family members read off the names of every person that's died. Still now, 17 years later, we do that. And all of America watches this. And terrorism remains foremost in Americans' mind. Those three issues are the ones which are going to determine the U.S.-China relationship. Not all the noise that exists today, people looking at this tariff and this restriction and that restriction and this visa.
Okay.
And ultimately, it's going to be driven by what the people think. And the people are going to demand, both in the United States and in China, that the governments be cooperative, not conflicting.
We hope that will be the case. Steve, what a pleasure.
It will be the case. It will be the case, Tianjin.
Stay with us on World Insight, still to come. On the eve of the Summer Davos in Tianjin, Managing Director of the World Economic Forum discusses how the Fourth Industrial Revolution intertwines with geopolitics and societies. The Summer Davos in Asia is being held from the 18th to the 20th of September in the beautiful Chinese coastal city of Tianjin. The theme of this annual meeting is Shaping Innovative Societies in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. China has been hosting the annual meeting of the new champions since 2007. Once again, Premier Li Keqiang will be speaking at the event. More than 2,000 industry leaders from 111 countries are expected to convene in Tianjin, which is a rotating host with Dalian. Their discussions will feature buzzwords such as artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, blockchain, and drones, which have been temporarily banned from flying over the city during the event. As the trade war between China and the U.S. continues to escalate, conversations about globalization and protectionism are not in short supply. China's central bank governor and finance minister are among the attendees, and they are likely to restate China's commitment to reform and opening up during this uncertain time. The top thinkers of our time might not present solutions to all our challenges in the next 3 days, but they will certainly offer lots of insight. World Insight host Tianwei recently sat down with David Eichmann, Chief Representative Officer in China and Managing Director of the World Economic Forum. He shared his insights on the technological revolution and Davos.
Mr. Eichmann, what a pleasure to see you here in Beijing.
Nice to see you again, Tianjin.
Yeah, whether the forum is really catching up with all the latest development, geopolitics, technology, and also about the political changes, economic, financial areas, so many things.
Right now, with all these changes and all of the tensions in the world, We need a forum like the World Economic Forum annual meeting of new champions to bring people together in dialogue that can catalyze real action. But how do you stay abreast? You know, how do you keep up with all of these changes? One of the real features of this Summer Davos is the fact that we not just have the big companies there, the ones with the real power, but also all of the disruptors and shapers and the young generation who come in with their new ideas, the young scientists and the young startups who are actually making this future.
You see, people are looking at the priorities. The priorities is geopolitics. A $250 billion US trade dispute that is going on between China and the United States. On the one hand, the world economic is relevant because it's a world stage to discuss all these topics. On the other hand, West want to be, in a way, neutral because you have people coming from all sides in order to debate. So that is quite a fine balance, I would assume, Mr. Aikman.
The current geopolitical tensions is that many of them are actually driven because of technology. What's really happening right now are significant geopolitical, geostrategic shifts in the nature of competition between nations and between regions. And the fourth industrial revolution is causing huge upheaval. It's creating new winners and new losers. And so more than ever, we need dialogue around these technologies and how we can together try and mitigate some of the risks. Because of course these technologies have tremendous potential for countries to leapfrog, for societies to progress. But there are also a lot of inherent risks.
Talking about the technologies, there are so many new developments, whether it is AI or other areas. On the one hand, you want to make sure in the discussion, many areas are being covered. But on the other hand, you don't want to be bogged down by only specifics, but rather be able to look at the bigger picture. That's what West is about, isn't it? So that is also a fine balance, I have to say, Mr. Aikman.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the advantages we have is that we're not talking about one specific technology. What the World Economic Forum is focused on is what is the impact of all of these technologies on the economy and society, on global governance, on international relations. What is the impact of these technologies on trade? And what we have to do, and what I think we do very well at the annual meeting of new champions, is to create the big sessions where we can inform and provide people with insights and give them the big picture and show them what's over the horizon. And that's probably about half of the sessions that we run in Tianjin. The other half are very small working level meetings, sometimes with only a dozen participants, really focused on the nuts and bolts of what are the standards and policies that we need, or how do we inject more ethics into AI? What is the real potential of blockchain, and how does a board think about that in their corporate governance discussions? These are really pragmatic nuts and bolts discussions around specific technologies. So we can bridge and give people the big picture and the impact and what it's really doing in the world, but also get down and roll up our sleeves and work on some of the much needed solutions that are required.
Coming from the business community, people are very pragmatic. Talking about technology is fascinating, but technology does not necessarily lead to real productivity. For now, some of them. So how to do that link is also a big question. How to make sure companies are going to have more income in a way, benefit their workers, and many of the issues related to that, it's also a big question.
One of the big challenges, and you see this at the company level, you see this at the geostrategic level, is that almost all of these technologies are a two-edged sword. On the one hand, creating new opportunities. So new industries like AI or advanced manufacturing will allow some countries to leapfrog and to become much more competitive internationally. At the same time, whether it's within firms in terms of automation replacing workers and certain jobs, whether that's the impact within society, and even shutting the door for some emerging markets who will no longer be able to move from agrarian in the sort of first industrial revolution to the second industrial revolution and advanced manufacturing. Some of those ways will be shut, and this is creating new winners and new losers. And here I think we're going to see, as we discussed in Davos this January, more fractures in the world, more tensions in the world. And we really need to focus down at the company level, at the country level, at the regional level.
The fourth industrial revolution is transforming everything, as you just said. So how about WEF, the World Economic Forum? I mean, you've been there for decades, right? The question is whether the WEF is relevant vis-a-vis the fourth industrial revolution. How are you reforming within yourself? And even here in China, how are you going to transform your businesses and your operations here through industrial revolution?
As an organization, we're really trying to understand how we can be a more relevant platform. And that means, in a lot of cases, not taking ownership over everything. As an international organization focused on public-private cooperation and having a positive impact in the world, one of the things we did over the last years was launch many initiatives, many projects to try and catalyze positive change, to try and improve agricultural yields in Africa or make technology safer. And what we realized is we have to be more like a platform. We actually have to enable others to do great things through our organization and on our platform. The same way that software developers realized that the real power was to be the platform and to be the community on which others could act, not doing everything yourselves. One of the new big developments for the World Economic Forum is these centers for the fourth industrial revolution, where many leaders were coming to us from business and from government saying, how do we deal with these technologies? How do we regulate them to make them safer for our population? Or for businesses to say, how can you get the roadblocks out of the way because governments don't understand the technology?
And Mr. Aikman, that's urgent, isn't it? And the question is whether the World Economic Forum will be still, as some say, the talk shop, or you're really going to have some real discussions about some of the crucial issues you just mentioned, Mr. Aikman.
Well, I think to people who worry about the forum being a talk shop, what I like to point out is that our events are not conferences. They're not events where people come and listen to interesting speakers. They're working meetings, and they sum up the work which is going on throughout the year. So these centers, which I just mentioned to you, have task forces of government, business, academia working together to define the standards, the protocols, the guiding principles of how government can use AI to improve public services, how a nation like the United Arab Emirates can make sure that their data policy is future-proof, or how a state like Maharashtra in India can use drones to improve agricultural yields. These are tangible projects which the network of fourth industrial centers are working on, and they bring those learnings and those results and those experts to our events for further dialogue so that other governments can say, let's try that in China, or companies can say, how do I get behind that development because I see it being very positive for my core business and having a good impact on society.
One of the biggest things about the World Economic Forum is many that come to you are being transparent and therefore information shared, discussion done. But the thing is about big data, for example, about artificial intelligence, for example, the debates have been evolving recently, particularly regarding national boundaries. And therefore, is WEF's discussion about all of this still going to be relevant? Once again, that's a relevancy, but that's very important relevancy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you cannot control it. You cannot decide on it. It has to be different governments and different players decide on their own whether they want to be in a way that they can share resources.
Which is why having an open source platform, which is why having an open dialogue that welcomes all into the table and into the discussion is so fundamentally important. What you see now with these technologies, and as we talked about in Davos in January this year, we're no longer just in a multipolar world. We're in a multi-conceptual world. Different jurisdictions, different countries have fundamentally different ideas about the way in which technologies should be developed, how they should be governed, what benefits they should bring for society. And here, the diversity of views is a real strength. My favorite example is self-driving cars.
Okay.
You know, in the West, we have this notion that the self-driving car must be completely autonomous, an individual capable of all of its navigating and understanding its environment. It's a very Western thinking. Here in China, it's a little bit different attitude. It's about how does that car interact with the city? It needs to talk to the city to say, how fast can I go? Is that a stop sign? What's the latest traffic rules? So it's much more a Confucian model, or a different thinking in terms of what the car's role and interaction should be with the city. Fundamentally different. Neither one is correct. Both have their strengths and their weaknesses. But we lose out in the global discussion if we don't have those two concepts bumping up against each other, talking with each other, trying to understand each other's concepts and the benefits. So we can build up greater understanding on these issues, which are shared issues, because these technologies don't know any borders. The challenges that we're facing in the world don't care about our regional politics. So we have to keep the dialogue between the global and the local.
That's a lot of job for you, David, I have to say, because it's But on the other hand, I remember that phrase you just used very well. You said bumping up to each other. So is the World Economic Forum ready, particularly the new champion in the summer, ready for the bumping up against each other, different parties together?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's
not
why,
afraid of controversies?
Not afraid of controversies. And this is why, we spend so much time throughout the year working on these projects and making sure that when we come together, we're bringing the most relevant voices and the most thoughtful voices. Without the dialogue, without bridging that understanding, we can't possibly work together, and we can't possibly find the areas where we have shared interests. We don't always have shared values. We don't always have shared concepts, but we do have shared interests. We're all 7 billion people on one planet with a finite amount of resources, and we've got to try and find the best way forward.
Mr. Aikman, many of those that are coming to Davos, whether it's winter or summer for the new champions, are having one question, I'm sure, at the back of their mind: where the world is going. Of course, that question has been the one from the very beginning of the World Economic Forum, but this is becoming ever more relevant because of unilateralism, protectionism. And World Economic Forum is a multilateral platform. Is WEF confident about a multilateral approach for the future? When you are talking about improve the state of the world, which is the slogan for you for decades, what exactly are you talking about?
We have been highlighting the challenges and the excesses of globalization since the 1990s, and trying to get people to focus on bridging some of those gaps, whether it's the digital divide, whether it's income inequalities, whether it's the gender gap. We've been working actively to try and bridge those gaps. The challenge is that many people, not just in the United States and in the West, but many people around the world feel that globalization hasn't worked for them. Now, from our vantage point, if we look at the data, if we would argue that globally the facts belie a different reality, that more people have been lifted out of poverty, that our societies are more safe and more inclusive, and there have been more benefits. But the challenges remain, and I think right now we need more dialogue than ever. But if we can't have dialogue at the global level, how can we take it down to the regional and sub-regional level to make sure that we're really working on the issues that are confronting these societies? When we can turn the tide and get globalization and multilateralism working for everyone better, we can reignite the global discussions.
China, over the years, have been bringing out a lot of different initiatives and suggestions, such as Belt and Road Initiative, such as how the world will be run through the system of G20, and many others. So how will these concepts, together with some of the other concepts and initiatives already existing in the world, interact with one another within the Davos mechanism?
I think China has recognized the power of the World Economic Forum platform, not just from the state leaders' participation, but also from the company participation.
Private sector as well.
Private sector as well. And I think what that means is China's voice is getting stronger. China's voice is more present in these discussions. Oftentimes, in the past, there was a feeling that China had its initiatives and the world had its initiatives, and never the twain shall meet. And in fact, on our platform, they do meet. For example, this year, one of the discussions I'm most interested to participate in is around a green Belt and Road initiative. The Belt and Road initiative, which is clearly an important regional cooperation initiative, but how can they bring in standards to make it more environmentally friendly, to make the investments more sustainable, to make the projects more socially inclusive?
This year, 40th anniversary China's reform and opening up. The World Economic Forum has been working with China for decades, as shown through many of your historical photos. Mr. Aikman, how do you see, both as the representative of World Economic Forum here in China and also working here in China, about the opportunities and the challenges that China is facing right now, 4 decades after its decision to reform and open up?
The thing that I am most in awe of, and I have to say in awe, is the Chinese people's capacity to deal with change. It's incredible over the last 40 years, or even in the last 3 years that I've been living here, how much change happens and how the Chinese people embrace that change. I remember having a discussion.
And how you are embracing that change as a result as well.
Well, I think that's one of the real challenges of living in such a dynamic society, is keeping up with the change and staying healthy and staying focused. But I think, you know, I remember two and a half years ago having a discussion with one of the large credit card companies, you know, saying, "Oh, aren't you worried about these new mobile payment, you know, e-payment technologies?" "Oh, no, not an issue. We're not worried. We're so important as an organization." And then you see the disruption and how now in our daily lives, some of us don't even carry a wallet anymore because we can do everything through our mobile device. And that change has happened so quickly. And I am just in awe of the Chinese people's ability to embrace that technology, to grow with it, to aid in its development. And I think that really speaks, you know, very positively about China's future, because it's not the biggest countries that are going to do well. It's the most flexible and the most adaptable and the most resilient countries that are going to do well in the Fourth Industrial Revolution.
Mr. Aikman, it's always been a pleasure talking to you, and I know you have a lot of work to do leading up to the Summer Davos in Tianjin. Thank you so much for sharing your time.
Thank you.
Really
Pleasure to be
appreciate
with
it.
you,
Thank you.
Thanks, Tianjin.